Without objection.
Madam President, I call up amendment number 2375 and ask that it be made pending.
Clerk will report.
The senator from Arizona, Mr. McCain, proposes an amendment number 2375.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent for the readings of the amendment be suspended.
Without objection.
This amendment would take the $1.7 billion in this bill, $1.7 billion in earmarks and pork barrel projects in this bill, 589 congressionally directed spending projects known by most Americans as earmarks, and instead redirect that money toward air traffic control modernization. You know, modernizing our outdated air traffic control system will positively impact all Americans, not just a favored few. It would decrease airport delays, improving the flow of commerce and advancing our nation's air quality by reducing aircraft carbon emissions, unlike earmarks that only affect a small segment of our nation's population, and generally those Americans who happen to live in a state represented by a senator who is a member of the Appropriations Committee. For example, the distinguished manager of the bill has secured more earmarks than any other member. 50 earmarks, including $2 million for a bike trail in Spokane. A bike trail. Right now, with the American people hurting all over America, we're going to spend an additional $2 million of their money for a bike trail and $750,000 for a, quote, Freight Transportation Policy Institute. $750,000 of my taxpayers' dollars is going to be spent in the state of Washington for a Freight Transportation Policy Institute. Other earmarks in this bill include $500,000 for construction of a beach park promenade in Pascagoula, Mississippi. According to Citizens Against Government Waste, an organization that has done incredible work on behalf of the taxpayers of America for many years, I quote, "The population of Pascagoula in 2008 was 23,609. If each resident of the town paid $21.18 towards the beachfront park promenade, federal taxpayers, most of whom are unlikely ever to visit, would be off the hook." And that's the point. Most Americans will never benefit from these earmark projects, except for those who happen to ride bikes in Spokane, Washington, or walk the beach in Pascagoula, Mississippi. Alternatively, all Americans are impacted daily by our nation's air traffic control system. Every day, Americans sit on a runway and miss meetings, children's soccer games, family dinners, and other important events due to air traffic control delays that could have been avoided if our nation had a modernized air traffic control system. Thousands of goods are delayed for delivery each day due to air traffic delays, which results in more than $40 billion of costs each year that are passed on to consumers, according to the Joint Economic Committee. The Government Accountability Office estimates that 1 in every 4 flights is delayed. In 2007, the aviation industry recorded the second worst year for delays, with 27% of all flights that year being delayed. And when you look at places like the Eastern Corridor, it's far worse. Although air traffic overall was down in 2008, due in part to economic factors that led airlines to reduce service, there was no significant reduction in traffic at the most congested airports, such as those in the New York and New Jersey area. Congestion and delays at key airports cascade across the entire system. Moreover, according to the FAA, even if traffic is reduced, congestion at these key airports will not be significantly reduced without implementing a modernized air traffic control system. The airlines have called our air traffic control system, quote, an outdated World War II radar system. The FAA's Next Generation Air Traffic Transportation System, NextGen, will transform the current ground-based radar air traffic control system to one that uses precision satellites, digital, network communications, and an integrated weather system. Moving from a ground-based to a satellite-based system will enable more flights to occupy the same airspace, meaning that the on-time performance improvements would be a reality with triple the aircraft capacity according to the airlines. However, the administration and Congress have not provided adequate funding toward air traffic control modernization and instead continue to fund billions of dollars of earmarks. The FAA estimates that it will cost up to $42 billion to implement a modern air traffic control system. Congress only appropriated $188 million for air traffic control modernization in 2008 and $638 million in 2009. The bill before the Senate today only dedicates $358 million towards air traffic control modernization, but it dedicates $1.7 billion towards earmarks. Get that, $358 million towards air traffic control modernization, which would benefit all Americans, $1.7 billion in earmarks. Instead of providing Americans with something they want, which is on-time airline departures and arrivals, Congress spent close to $1 trillion of taxpayers' hard-earned money on a stimulus bill that provided $500,000 to build a state park in Rhode Island, $14 million for construction of an airport in Alaska, in an Alaskan town with only 167 residents that's 10 miles away from an airport, millions to New York welfare recipients for the purchase of cell phones. Congress also spent close to $3 billion of America's hard-earned tax dollars on a Cash for Clunkers program. At some point, and it's beginning out there, my friends, I tell my colleagues, it's beginning. It's beginning with the Tea Parties. It's beginning with the marches on Washington. It's beginning with the demonstrations and rallies all over America. It's out there. They're sick and tired of the corruption that exists here in our nation's capital. I noticed the other day that there was another individual who was caught up in the Abramoff scandal, going on trial. That's now 22 people who have either pled guilty or been found guilty over the Abramoff scandal that I'm happy to say the senator from North Dakota, Senator Dorgan, and I worked on. And guess what the scandal was all about? It was about earmarks. It was about pork barrel projects. That's what that Abramoff scandal was about. That's why Duke Cunningham resides in federal prison. That's why there are people under investigation, and there will be more indictments. The American people are sick and tired of it. They're sick and tired of it. So we got to stop it and at least spend money on worthy projects that will impact all Americans. Earlier this year, the president stated, and I quote, "Earmarks have been used as a vehicle for waste and fraud and abuse. Projects have been inserted at the 11th hour without review and sometimes without merit in order to satisfy the political or personal agendas of a given legislator rather than the public interest. There are times when earmarks may be good on their own, but in the context of a tight budget, might not be our highest priority." That's what the President of the United States says. Well, if the President of the United States is serious, he will veto this bill. He will veto the $1.7 billion in earmarks and pork barrel projects that are on it. And he's right. Earmarks have been used as a vehicle for waste. In 2001, the Senate passed the 2002 Transportation Appropriations Bill Conference Report that included an earmark for the Odyssey Maritime Discovery Center. That Discovery Center happens to be in Seattle, Washington. I have a picture of it here. The Discovery Center opened in 1998, but has seen decreased intelligence year after year despite continued federal earmarks. As the Seattle Post-Intelligencer wrote in 2003, container ships and fishing nets don't scream sex appeal. The Discovery Center procured $250,000 from an earmark sponsored by the senator from Washington, and in the fiscal year 1998 Commerce State Justice Appropriations Bill, $3 million in the fiscal 2002 Transportation Appropriations Bill, and $475,000 in the 2006 Commerce, Justice, State Appropriations Bill. And as a result of that earmark, the museum put out a press release. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that that press release be made a part of the record.
Without objection.
And the press release said, Michael Bittner, Executive Director of the Odyssey Maritime Discovery Center, today expressed appreciation to U.S. Senator Patty Murray for securing $3 million for new transportation educational initiatives, programs, and exhibits for Odyssey. Quote, Washington State is the most transportation and trade-dependent state in the nation. Odyssey is in a unique position to educate our public and our children about the need to enhance our transportation infrastructure so this region can maintain and expand its status as the nation's leading gateway to the Pacific Rim. Senator Murray has exceedingly well-served transportation, and particularly this region, through this appropriation. I congratulate her and thank her. In 1997, while seeking an earmark of $250,000 for the center, Senator Murray said, quote, the center will establish an educational link between the everyday maritime fishing, trade, and environmental activities that occur in the waters of Puget Sound in Alaska and the lessons students learn in the classroom. Through high-tech and interactive exhibits, over 300,000 children and adults per year will discover that what happens in our waters, on our coastlines, at our ports affect our state and nation's economic livelihood. 300,000 people, children and adults, didn't show up every year. 100,000 people didn't show up every year. 50,000 people didn't show up every year. 30,000 people showed up in most years. In January 2008, the Seattle Times reported that the Port of Seattle wants to stop subsidizing the money-losing Odyssey Maritime Discovery Center Museum, which owes the port $1.5 million in back rent and has received millions more in taxpayers' assistance, unquote. The article also stated that, quote, Odyssey, which bills itself as the nation's only contemporary interactive maritime museum, has never hit its attendance targets. At its inception, the facility on Seattle's Pier 66 hoped to attract 300,000 visitors a year to pay its rent and operating costs. Instead, it has attracted fewer than 30,000 visitors most years. According to Odyssey's most recent available tax form, the museum received revenues of $262,000 in 2005 and had expenses of $1.6 million. In fact, according to a February 2002 in the Seattle Times, the Port Authority agreed to help Odyssey by taking 30,000 free tickets a year in lieu of $21,000 in monthly payments for rent. However, the article continued, fewer than 10,000 of the visitors used the free tickets from the port. The Discovery Center was not even able to attract visitors when the tickets were free. When the Port Commission terminated the museum's lease, a port spokeswoman stated, quote, it is finally acknowledging this museum isn't ever going to succeed as currently structured. So what did Americans' hard-earned dollars get for the $3 million earmark for, quote, educational initiatives, programs, and exhibits? According to a 2003 article in the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, quote, Spinner's Riddle and Informational Scavenger Hunt. At each station, participants had to answer exhibit-based questions such as, in the Quiet Bay, what kind of worm is listed? The answers help solve the riddle. What time do sharks like to go to the dentist? Also available due to taxpayers' dollars, a rack of orange survival suits kids can try on, a simulator that lets you steer, an 850-long virtual container ship, et cetera, et cetera. So despite $3 million of taxpayer money spent on these interactive exhibits, attendance continued to fall, and this past year, the museum closed its doors, except to host private parties, such as in December, when it hosted a fashion show. The invitation read, this December, treat yourself to the best of the best, the mother of all fashion events. It went on to say that the museum was, quote, retransformed with a massive stage and runway lighting and concert quality sound. You will feel the glitz and glamour of a Los Angeles red carpet event. However, that wasn't the only earmark in the fiscal year 2002 appropriations bill that failed to perform. And let me point out, at the time, I took to the floor and objected strenuously to this $3 million earmark. I objected strenuously to it on the grounds I didn't know that it would fail. I'm not surprised that it would fail, but I wasn't surprised. Why in the world? Why in the world should my constituents in Arizona give $3 million to a museum that's going to fail, that's supposed to be for much-needed transportation projects? Drive around America and see whether we need to spend transportation money on a failed museum, or do we want to spend it on the things that we need? So that wasn't the only earmark in the fiscal year 2002 appropriations bill that failed to perform. Also tucked in, and I objected to it at the time, was a $4.5 million for a boat that nobody wanted, according to the headline of an October 14, 2000 article in the Seattle Times. The article continued, and I quote, "The Navy paid $4.5 million to build the boat. But months before the hull ever touched the water, the Navy gave the boat to the University of Washington." Now, if we want to give money directly to the University of Washington, my friends, let's give it to the University of Washington. But this was supposed to be for the United States Navy. And why did the Navy do that? Because the Navy strongly stated they didn't want the boat to start with. Yet the senator from Washington, in her wisdom, decided that the Navy needed that boat. It didn't need the boat. But months before the hull ever touched the water, the Navy gave the boat to the University of Washington. The school never found a use for it either. What would the Navy waste taxpayer dollars on a boat nobody wanted? Earmarks were inserted into different bills to force the Navy and the Coast Guard to buy boats they didn't ask for. $17.65 million in all. $17.65 million in all for two boats that neither the Navy nor the Coast Guard wanted, and now one of them belongs to the University of Washington and the other belongs to the sheriff. So, some of the boats were never even used, period. One boat, as I mentioned, was given to the University of Washington, who sold it to the federal government's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association's National Marine Sanctuaries Program for a regional sanctuaries research program doing research all along the West Coast. However, NOAA emailed my staff today and stated that this boat has been out of service since January, since there is no funding available to support a project on this boat. According to a story that aired on PBS's Frontline, one of the Coast Guard boats was sold to Alameda County Sheriff's Department, and according to a sheriff's deputy, quote, "We paid $1 for this boat, and I don't think we actually paid $1, but it was turned over to us." A $4.5 million boat that the Navy and the Coast Guard did not want were constructed, $4.5 million for each, and neither one of them was ever used by the Coast Guard or the United States Navy. They're just two examples of wasted taxpayer money that were spent on earmarks, were not necessary, not beneficial. Instead, Congress and the administration should refocus their efforts and priorities toward improving all Americans' lives by modernizing our air traffic control system. I ask my colleagues to support the amendment to take the $1.7 billion in earmark funding toward the implementation of air traffic control modernization that will improve the lives of all Americans. There are a lot more stories, Madam President, that I have out there of these earmarks and pork barrel projects that were inserted, like the museum, like these boats that the Navy and the Coast Guard never wanted, and we wasted $17.5 million. American people are rising up. They did over the weekend here in our nation's capital when tens of thousands of them said, no more. No more mortgaging our children's futures. No more of this earmark and pork barrel spending, which has spread corruption. I ask my colleagues to support the amendment. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Missouri.